Clown alert, people. The Atlanta Falcons have just turned into an absolute clown show. They went from being one of the most underrated teams in the NFL, a dark horse Super Bowl contender, to a month later refusing to bench a quarterback that has thrown 8 interceptions and 0 touchdowns, and yet Raheem Morris, their head coach, still refuses to bench Kirk Cousins in favor of the quarterback that they drafted in the top 10 of this past year's draft, when they had other areas of concern like finding another pass rusher, adding another good cornerback in that secondary. But instead, they want to just play the long game with Michael Penix and not throw him out there and just keep losing games with Kirk Cousins just giving out turnovers like he's Santa's helper. It's one thing to have a rookie quarterback making mistakes, but it's unacceptable to have a veteran quarterback that you gave this massive contract to in free agency to have 8 turnovers and your 4-game win streak. That's just a flat-out benchable offense. And I don't see how anybody can defend Raheem Morris' decision to continue to roll with Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins is costing the Falcons football team. Is it a team game? Yes. Is Kirk Cousins the sole reason why the Falcons are losing these games? No, but he's 95% of the reason why the Falcons are losing. Against the Chargers, he flat-out lost that game. He had 4 interceptions. A couple of them came in the red zone. Really costly. At this point, you got to throw out Michael Penix. Michael Penix was never one of those quarterbacks that needed a year on the bench. He was already a day one kind of starter, which is why I'm still dumbfounded by why the Falcons felt the need to draft him when they already had so much confidence in Kirk Cousins. Well, it turns out Kirk Cousins can't move like how he used to coming off that Achilles injury. And I'm not talking about just scrambling around in the pocket and extending plays and picking up yards with his legs. I'm talking about just being able to hand the football off. Do you know that the Atlanta Falcons run the football more to the right than any other team in the NFL, to the point where it's predictable that they're going to run it to the right, because Kirk Cousins, with that Achilles injury, can't really move off that left leg. He also can't really do a lot of play action bootlegs off that left leg neither. And it's getting to the point where that injury is limiting the Atlanta Falcons offense, because they can only do so much due to his lack of mobility. And when you got a quarterback that's like a sitting statue back there, it would be in your best interest to go ahead and start the younger option that gives you more mobility, that doesn't handicap your offense. The Falcons got a really good offensive coordinator, one of the better offensive coordinators in the league. He's not the problem. The problem is you're giving him an old man back there at quarterback to work with. You got to have, in today's NFL, a quarterback that has just a little bit of wheels. When you're playing Kirk Cousins, it's easy to defend him because you don't have to worry about him killing you for a 10 or 15-yard scramble. And with the same injury that Aaron Rodgers suffered, we've seen how Aaron Rodgers hasn't been able to move like how he used to be in his prime days with the Green Bay Packers. He runs like he has shit stuck up in his ass. And that's the same way that Kirk Cousins plays. And not only is Kirk Cousins throwing a bunch of interceptions, but he also has been a fumbling machine. Kirk Cousins has 20 total turnovers at this point of the season. He leads the NFL in turnovers. He's been turning the football over every single game that the Falcons have lost this year. And if the Falcons are going to be able to salvage this season and get to the playoffs, they got to go to Michael Penix. They just have to. Because if not, you're pretty much just waving the white flag and just saying, you know what, we accept having a losing season. We're just going to tank for a draft pick, and we're just going to give up on a season that looked so promising at one point. Because a month ago, the Falcons were 6-3. They had a clear lead in the NFC South. It looked like they were going to not only win this division, but possibly be able to make some noise in the playoffs. To a month later, not only are they on the outside looking in of getting into the postseason, but you now have lost the division lead to the same team that you swept twice in the season. That's a sign that the Falcons are not a good team. Remember what I like to tell you guys all the time. After Thanksgiving, it's when teams start to separate themselves. That's when the pretenders separate themselves from the contenders. And the Atlanta Falcons have separated themselves in the worst way possible. Not just as pretenders, but as a team that was just too good to be true. They were a good story for while it lasted, and now all of a sudden they've played some quality teams and they've lost. They got blown out by the Broncos. They got blown out by the Minnesota Vikings today. This is not a good football team. This is a average to below average squad. Not only is the offense struggling because they refuse to bench their starting quarterback that just can't move at all, but the defense isn't good, and they refuse to fire Jimmy Lake. And Raheem Morris is supposed to be a defensive-minded head coach. The expectations for the Falcons was to be a playoff team with how well they've drafted on the offense side of the football and what they brought in on defense, acquiring Justin Simmons and pairing him up with Jesse Bates and having AJ Terrell and getting Matt Judon. You don't make those moves if your goal is not to make it to the playoffs. The goal for Atlanta was to win this division. They were the odds-on favorite to win the NFC South this year, and yet they look nowhere close to playing at that level. This has been a catastrophic fall off that we have seen over the last 4 games from the Atlanta Falcons, mainly due to Kirk Cousins just not being a starting caliber quarterback anymore. He went from being a top 15 quarterback when he was balling out against the Philadelphia Eagles. He had that historic Thursday night game against the Buccaneers to all of a sudden looking like one of the worst 5 quarterbacks in the league. I think that Kirk Cousins has a legit argument for being a bottom 3 quarterback right now. As insane as it may be to hear that if you're a Falcons fan, it seems like that's the truth. Kirk Cousins, he's thrown more interceptions than he has thrown touchdowns. He has 0 touchdowns in the last 4 games. Are you kidding me? And you still refuse to bench him? Now, I'm not going to lie. I do have a little bit of an agenda for why I want Kirk Cousins benched outside of him playing bad, because my fantasy football team right now, I'm in the playoffs, and I don't have a trustworthy quarterback in Jordan Love. Therefore, I was banking on Kirk Cousins stinking it up one more time against his former team, which, you know, the Vikings fans booed him, by the way, and rightfully so, because, you know, the way that he left them, and plus they were tampering with them when the Minnesota Vikings were the biggest winner. The biggest winners were the Minnesota Vikings getting rid of a quarterback that just wasn't good anymore. They lucked up getting Sam Darnold. Look how good Sam Darnold has played relative to how Kirk Cousins has looked. So I was hoping that once Kirk Cousins stunk it up today against the Vikings, that they finally would bench him and they would throw Michael Penix out there, because I was going to pick up Michael Penix and start him as my QB1 and expect him to lead me to a fantasy football championship. But it looks like that's not going to happen, because the Atlanta Falcons are just so stubborn that they just don't want to play Michael Penix for no reason at all, even though they invested a top 10 pick into him, and you have a quarterback that obviously is a bad investment. You know, one thing about investing in the stocks is that they always say the number one rule is to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. When you see a stock that's just going down, you don't continue to hold on to it with the thought process that, okay, like it's going to end up bouncing back up. Sometimes you have to look at the analytics and you just got to say, you know what, I'm losing too much money by holding on to this stock. It may end up being a lot worse. And even if it does somewhat bounce back, you know, I'll just take the loss on that. The Falcons have to cut their losses with Kirk Cousins. You just gave a lot of money to a guy that isn't playing up to the level of that contract. And you got to look at yourself in the mirror if you're Raheem Morris and ask yourself, which matters more? Being committed to a guy that I gave all this money to, or going with the guy that's supposed to be the future in hopes that he could save our season? Because if there ever was a good test to determine if Michael Penix was a great pick, it's now. You're on a 4-game losing streak. You're 6-7, and you pretty much have to win now. You may have only one more game that you can lose if you want to get to the playoffs. This is the time to figure out just if Michael Penix has that dog in him, and I believe that he does. And I'm really frustrated that the Atlanta Falcons continue to hold Michael Penix in this cage when the Raiders could have used this dude. If Michael Penix was playing for the Raiders right now, I think that they probably would be a 6-8 win team right now. That's how good Michael Penix is. This guy, according to the draft community and a lot of scouts out there, was good enough to be a day one starter on anybody that he got drafted to. And with how much success a lot of these rookie quarterbacks at his same draft class have had, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, even Drake May. Drake May is on the freaking Patriots, and he's doing pretty good. So if Drake May's balling out, Bo Nix is balling out, you mean to tell me that Michael Penix couldn't do the same thing with him having more talent and in a better situation than what those other guys are in? He has Kyle Pitts, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, a really good offensive line, and you're just going to allow your season to go to waste because you want to be committed to old man Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins is a really likable guy, but eventually you have to move on from. You just have to sell your stock before you end up just losing it all. And at this point, I think it's a fireable offense if the Atlanta Falcons don't make it to the playoffs this year. Do y'all? Because this isn't one of those things where we came into this season saying, yeah, this is going to be a long-term rebuild. No, the thought process was that Raheem Morris will be able to come in here and make this team an instant winner of the weakest division in the NFL. You were 6-3 in first place in the NFC South. The Buccaneers were down and out with all the injuries they had, and yet you let them get back into it. This is a fireable offense. The fact that you want to be stubborn with sticking with a guy that has 8 interceptions and 0 touchdowns in the last 4 games, that is an insane stat line. Do you not know how insane it is to say that? You would think that I'm getting that stat wrong, but I promise you, if you look it up, over Kirk Cousins' last 4 games amid this 4-game losing streak, he has 0 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. That is an alarming stat line to have. Anybody with common sense would have been benched this fool.